And I really want to thank each of you for joining us for this virtual mainstay for us over the last several years. And most of them are usually done in person, so we're trying something new tonight, which I'm very excited about. Just a few updates I thought might be helpful to get us started is that one of the most important things you get from KJZZ and NPR are the constant and fact-based reports about what's happening around the nation and here in Arizona. And with your support, with each of your support, that is what makes it happen. You are helping keep this community and the state informed with national news from NPR folks and from our own KJZZ newsroom. So I can't thank you enough for all that you're doing to help make that happen. And I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you for being supporters of this radio station. Back to Radio Night is just one way for us to kind of give back and give you some access to national hosts and national reporters and, just to see behind the curtain, I think a little bit about how people do the jobs that they do. So we're really glad that you're here. A couple of notes as you look to what has become a bit of a strange year, if I can even go that far. We, KJZZ and NPR, have a very full plate for the next several weeks and months. You will hear three presidential and one vice presidential debate on KJZZ in the coming weeks. You will hear 5 congressional districts and a Senate debate that we have here in Arizona over the next few weeks. So we've got a lot of election coverage ahead. And then obviously we are on top of and have been looking at daily the pandemic and the business fallout from that. And some of Scott's reporting, along with our own reporting here at KJZZ, has helped sort of bring all of us together in terms of what these changes to our daily lives are going to do for the long-term future. So it is a lot to process, and we get that, and we're trying to kind of keep it in context every day in terms of how we are presenting it to you and keeping you informed about how we do that. Tonight, NPR's Scott Horsley and KJZZ's Lauren Gilger are going to have just a conversation, a chat about the work that Scott does and sort of the things that are on people's minds in both the business community and in the national news. And I would love for all of us to interact and get your questions asked. Let's logistically talk about how that works. Right at the bottom of your screen here on Zoom is a little chat bubble. And if you click on that box, it'll open up a side window, and you can put your questions right in there, and you can address them to Lauren Gilger. Lauren will see those, and then she can move through them, parse through them. She has some questions of her own for Scott, and you can just send them right into her, and we will take a look at those tonight. So if you have questions, just raise a hand. Most of us can see each other on the way the grid is set up, so we can do that, and we'll definitely have some time for questions at the end. So without further ado, let me introduce to you NPR's Scott Horsley and KJZZ's Lauren Gilger. Lauren?
Thanks so much, John. Hi, everybody. It's good to see so many happy faces. Hi, Scott. Thank you so much for being here. I want to remind everyone to just mute themselves while we have the conversation in case you might hear my 2-year-old, but if anyone else has children running around or anything like that, we can still hear Scott tell us about all of his interesting escapades there covering economics for NPR. So I want to start with just a little bit about Scott. Let's get to know you a little bit, because I think mostly know you for your work in DC, whether it be at the White House or on the economics beat now, but you began your career right in San Diego, so you know the Southwest a little bit.
Yeah, I spent 14 happy years in San Diego. I started my career at some smaller markets, but I graduated to San Diego, and I worked for the member station there, the public radio member station there, KPBS, for about 7 years. And then I got hired by NPR, and they let me stay in San Diego for another 7 years. So that was the best of all possible worlds. I got to live in San Diego. My editors were 3,000 miles away. I didn't even have to change desks when I got the NPR gig. I left work as a KPBS employee on a Friday. My coworkers threw me a nice going away party, and then I came back to work on Monday and sat at the same desk and didn't even have to get a new phone number or anything. So it was kind of great. But yeah, I feel like, I was drinking Colorado River water just like you guys. So I feel like we're in the same watershed. And as a native Coloradan, I feel particularly close to folks in the West. I also covered John McCain's campaign in 2000, the latter part of 2007 and 2008. And of course, he would spend most of his weekends at home in Sedona, and then we would go off. We would set off on Monday morning, and that was also great for me because I could go home to San Diego, spend my weekend at home, do my laundry, pet my dog, and I became a regular on the 6 a.m. flight from San Diego to Sky Harbor, and then would link up with the McCain crew, and off we go to wherever it was. So spent a fair amount of time in your state. And when I was working for KPBS in San Diego, part of my beat was covering water. So I did follow the ups and downs of the arid West a good bit.
So you are familiar with the 104-degree temperatures we're all experiencing right now in the middle of September.
You know, I covered what I had when I had just gotten, when I first moved to San Diego. They were just coming out of a drought in the early 90s, and they were determined to get an independent water supply, independent of the Metropolitan Water District up in LA. San Diego always sort of felt like a poor stepchild to LA, so they tried to buy some farm water from the neighboring Imperial Valley, and they've ultimately been successful, but it took a lot longer than we thought. And it seemed like every time I would have to go to the Imperial Valley to do a story, it would be in August. Try as I might to schedule those trips in January or February, I would always go there. And yeah, that was a little bit like being in Phoenix. It was triple digits, and my car's AC was always a little anemic. So
just be glad this is a virtual event. Let's put it that way. As much as we would love to have you here in person.
I wish I could be there in person, but yeah, I guess when do you typically get a break there? Does it sort of October before it starts to?
Yeah, it should be about now, but it's not.
Yeah. Well,
it's looking like October at this point.
I lived in Tampa for 3 years. I worked for the member station there as well, which is, as hot as Phoenix plus humidity. And the worst thing about Tampa was October, because you'd say, well, it's hot everywhere in August, but by October it would still be very hot in Tampa, and you'd be saying everywhere else it's starting to get nice, and here it's still miserable. Tampa had a fantastic climate 6 months out of the year, and a miserable climate the other 6, especially as a kid from Colorado who, in Denver where I grew up, if it's 25% relative humidity, people start talking about how muggy it feels, and I did not adjust.
We have a lot in common then, yes. Yeah. So then you spent about a decade covering the White House under the Obama administration and the Trump administration. We'll get to that. But now you are, of course, NPR's chief economics correspondent. And you took this beat not all that long ago, and not all that long before sort of everything on the economic spectrum changed, like the entire world economy collapsed and is now trying to rebuild itself amid this pandemic. What was this like, being kind of relatively new to the beat, and then all of a sudden here you go?
Yeah, well, in a way it was a little bit of a homecoming for me, because I had covered when I got the NPR job, which was around 2000, 2001. I covered the electricity meltdown in California, which of course was tremendously costly for the state and for the economy of the area, but it was very good for my career. And so I kind of got on NPR's radar covering the electric meltdown in California, and they hired me to work on the business desk. And so for most of that 7 years I was reporting from San Diego, I was covering business, not strictly economics, but all kinds of business stories. And so then I got sort of detoured into the political beat and spent a lot of time doing that. And in a way, it was kind of a homecoming to come back to the business desk. And I was looking for a beat that would be important and significant. I anticipated that it would be a little bit less stressful and a little bit less high profile than the White House beat. But I didn't anticipate that we would go crashing into the worst recession in almost 100 years. So that's been a comeuppance, but it's been fascinating. I mean, it's a terrible a terrible story and an enormous amount of suffering, but it's also a very interesting story, and it's one that affects everybody, and it's got so many different facets to it that every week we're discovering some new piece of the story to tell. So it's been very rewarding in that way professionally.
Was there a moment, Scott, when you sort of realized this was as big as it was going to be?
It has dawned on me rather slowly. I confess. I mean, I had read Gina Kolata's book Flu some years ago, and so the notion of a pandemic, the notion of a novel virus for which we have no immunity that would circle the globe, was not foreign to me. And when we first started hearing reports out of China about what we now know as the coronavirus, I sort of realized, I think, at least intellectually, what the potential health consequences of that would be. But it did not occur to me just how devastating it would be for the economy. That didn't really, I mean, working all through February when we were reporting on, challenges for the supply chain and whether auto factories in this country would have to shut down because they couldn't get parts from Asia and that sort of thing. And we were reporting on Starbucks closing their stores in Shanghai and so forth. It still didn't quite hit me that this would have the economic consequences in the United States and worldwide that it has. It was only, and of course, the sort of the first signs were the gyrations in the stock market when investors kind of panicked in February, and we saw a record rapid plunge in the stock indexes. But when the shutdown happened in the early weeks of March, and then when we saw, week after week, millions of people filing claims for unemployment, and then we got that April jobs report that was just, one for the history books with 20 plus million payroll jobs up in smoke, a decade's worth of job growth. That was still a shocker. And on the other hand, the rebound has been surprising in many ways too. So the scale of it has just been remarkable. I remember I was on the business beat, the economics beat, for about a year before all this happened. And during that time, I wait breathlessly every quarter when the GDP report would come out. Did we have 2.9% growth or 3% growth? And that tenth of a point, which we'd spend days wondering which it was going to be, and then writing about how it had come out. And now we look at the second quarter, the forecast was a 36% drop in GDP, and it came in at 33, and we're like, well, that's pretty close, So just the scale of it has been remarkable. And likewise with the jobs numbers, 1.8 million jobs added in August. In normal times, that would be a blockbuster report. As it was, it's a disappointment because it was a deceleration from June and July. So it's everything is kind of multiplied by one or two orders of magnitude.
Yeah, the perspective has changed a whole lot.
For sure.
So one of the things I've been wanted to talk about, because I think you do this so well in your reporting, and especially with economics, like you take these really big national and international economic trends, like you're saying GDP and job growth and all the unemployment filings, et cetera, and you bring them home, right? Like you tell us what this means in real people's lives, which is what we often try and do as journalists. But I wonder if you can tell us sort of a few stories that you've reported in the months of this that really sort of brought the current economic reality home for you when you realized what this is doing to people.
Oh yeah, I mean, very early on. I mean, NPR was actually very proactive in sending its own reporters home. We were sent home from the office before maybe a week or two before the kind of national lockdown, and I don't know whether that was because our science reporters were out in front of the story, or just we had very good planners, and so I remember that first weekend in fairly early March. I think I was sent home on a Wednesday. I went to the office on a Wednesday and was told to work from home on Thursday and Friday, and we were told that we'd probably be working from home through the whole month of March. And we're like, oh my God, it's like 2.5 weeks. What are we going to do? And one of my colleagues had started to compile a list of people. I can't remember if we had put something out on Facebook or her Twitter feed or something, but we'd begun to ask people about how they were being affected by that. And so that first weekend in early March, I remember making calls from my house to, there was a woman who worked for a law firm where she had been told to not to work from home, to go home, because the partners or the associates were all working from home. She was a paralegal, and there was nobody for her to paralegal for, so that she was just sent home. And there was a guy who was a dispatcher for an airline. And anyway, these were just three or four people early on who were kind of in the very first wave of people to feel the effects of this. And I remember, and they were all, very nervous and wondering how they were going to pay their bills and what was going to happen. And of course, it just snowballed from there. And of course, within weeks, we were looking at whole industries that had basically slammed on the brakes. Hotels had basically closed up. The airlines were flying 5% of their regular traffic. Restaurants were shuttered, and one thing that's been interesting in talking to people, I mean, I've talked to people who've gone through an awful lot of suffering and an awful lot of angst, but also an enormous amount of resilience, and people have been really strong in dealing with this. And of course, part of it is it's such a widespread phenomenon. Ordinarily, I've talked to a lot of people who've lost jobs in earlier times, and oftentimes they're a little bit reluctant or shy to talk about losing their job. They feel like maybe there's some stigma attached to it. It's hard to have much stigma attached to it when it's 20 million people, or 22. It's so people, and there's a great. I remember one fella early on had told me about he got laid off from his company, and then pretty much 1 week, and the whole rest of the workforce got laid off the following week. And he was lucky because he was on the front end of the wave. He was able to get through to the unemployment people and get his unemployment payment started. The rest of them were in with the 6 million, the first tsunami of layoffs. And they were the ones who were stuck on the phone for 36 hours, couldn't get through. And he said, yeah, we're all in the same boat, but we're not all in the same seat on that boat. Some of us are further up in the bow, and some of us are kind of back in the back getting more prop wash.
So interesting, like the Titanic. So as we kind of watch this happen, you talk about the recovery, right? You're talking about how important that is, and how would you gauge it? Like, is it slow? Like, is this surprising how fast the economy has come back? And then I have a question or two about sort of the folks who might be left behind.
Yeah, well, the May jobs report was really a surprise. We lost 22 million jobs in March and April, and then in May we started gaining a few of them back. We had a few million back in May, and then quite a almost 7 million back in June. And May was a surprise. We didn't expect to see jobs rebound in May. I think everybody would have expected some rebound in June. All the forecasters were sort of expecting that things would start to open up again and people would go back to work in June. But to see it in May was surprising. And then the strong numbers in June, and you thought, okay, maybe this is going to be a V-shaped recovery. And then, of course, we didn't do what we needed to do to control the virus. And of course, in Arizona, you guys were very much aware of what happened then. We had this sort of, not even a second wave, but the wave washing over parts of the country that hadn't been affected initially. Initially we had New York and we had Seattle and to some extent California, but now that first wave was washing over the Sun Belt, and and having really profound effects. And so there was sort of a second series of shutdowns and stay-at-homes, and that's when you said, oh, it's not going to be just a quick one and done. This is not going to be easy. And since then, we've definitely seen a marked deceleration in the recovery. There were fewer jobs added in July than in June, fewer jobs in August than in July, and we're on track, it looks like, to have fewer jobs in September than in August. So the way Jay Powell of the Federal Reserve has described it is the easy part of the recovery is what we've had so far. We got back about half of the jobs that we lost. That those were the easy ones to get back, and now it's going to be the hard ones from here on out. And it's hard to see how things like airlines, hotels, the in-person meeting industry, entertainment, live music, any of that kind of stuff comes back in any sort of sustainable way unless and until there's not only a vaccine, but a vaccine that's been widely distributed and available. Mm-hmm. And that's that's going to be quick in the span of science, but a long time in the span of people's lives. And it's many more months that we're going to have to put up with very high unemployment probably. And what's kind of interesting, we did see Congress and the Fed act very quickly to sort of flood the zone with money to kind of cushion the blow. And that actually worked to a large extent. I mean, the savings rate went way up. Consumer spending bounced back pretty strongly on merchandise, not so much on services. People aren't spending on haircuts and manicures and stuff like that like they used to, but they're spending on food, and they're buying a lot of stuff from Amazon and all that. So the consumer spending has rebounded in some extent, but now we've had the lapse of the supplemental unemployment benefits. So you had 11 million people got a pay cut on August 1st. Mm-hmm. We thought that was going to have a real profound effect on consumer spending. It hasn't really showed up yet, but probably what that means is people are spending down a little bit of whatever savings they socked away in May, June, July. And once that's gone, that we may still see a kind of another hit.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because that's such a big economic story here in Arizona right now, because we are one of the states with the lowest unemployment benefits in the country. It's down to $240 a week for these people. And this is hundreds of thousands of people who still haven't gotten their jobs back. So what does that mean for the broader economy? Like you mentioned some industries that are out more affected than others, but is this going to disproportionately affect certain people, certain demographics in a way that's going to be hard to come back from?
Sure. I mean, it's anybody whose job sort of relies on working face-to-face or in close proximity to other people. Those are the jobs that are going to be hardest to recover. So that's, the food service industry, the hospitality industry, tourism, live entertainment, a lot of travel, commuting. And those are disproportionately low wage jobs. They're jobs that are disproportionately held by African Americans and in Arizona, Latinos. So those are the and also disproportionately by women. So this has been very much, I mean, and when I talk about those groups being disproportionately affected, I mean, this, if you're going to lose 22 million jobs, everybody's been affected. All groups have been affected. Those groups have been hit harder than others, but it's not like there aren't a lot of white men out of work as well. But it has definitely hit women hardest, African Americans harder, Latinos harder. Actually, it's interesting. Asian Americans have also been hit pretty hard. Their unemployment rate had been lower than the national average before the pandemic. It's now higher than the national average. And that's kind of interesting because Asian Americans as a group have higher than average educational attainment, and usually that's a pretty good insulator against layoffs, but not entirely, obviously.
Yeah. Okay, so we can't let you out of here without asking you about politics, because you covered the White House for so long. Yeah. I want to talk about this upcoming election, which is so soon too, but let's start with a little bit about covering the White House for that decade. I mean, you were under the Obama administration of the first few years of the Trump administration, and you were embedded in this when the political landscape was changing so much, when we became so divisive, when the line between sort of what's true and what's not true got more blurred. What was this like, and how apparent was it at the time that things were changing?
Right. Well, when I talked about my detour into politics, started with a careless email I wrote back in 2003. Howard Dean had gotten himself on the cover of Time magazine, and he was sort of tearing up the internet, and was very popular. And the betting at NPR and elsewhere was that he was going to be the Democratic nominee for the 2004 election cycle. And I wrote an email to Ron Elving, who at that time was the Washington editor, and the subject line was "Idle Thoughts of a Business Reporter." And I said that I remembered taking a course in American history when I was in college, where one of the books we read was about Huey Long and Father Coughlin, and their effort to sort of turn their mastery of the radio, the then novel medium of the radio, into political success. And that interested me because I was interested in radio. I worked for the college radio station, so I glommed onto that idea. And the fellow who wrote the book, Alan Brinkley, had a line something like, the passive activity of listening to the radio did not instill in their followers the sort of passionate and close tie that traditional, union hall ward heel politics did. So they had these big radio audiences, but it didn't really translate into political success. And my idle thoughts of a business reporter was, I wonder if this big internet following that Howard Dean has is going to turn out to be the same way. Like, lots of people like him on, or whatever the equivalent of, a like on Facebook in 2003 was. But how hard is that? That doesn't really take anything. And is it gonna stand the test of a bitter primary fight? And Ron said, yeah, that's a good question. Why don't you go do some reporting on that? And so I wound up covering Howard Dean for the fall of that campaign. And then when he flamed out, not as I had predicted exactly, but I kind of had, I wound up having to cover John Kerry. And then in 4 years later, similarly, all the smart money was on Mitt Romney. So I covered Mitt Romney during the fall, and he flamed out, and I wound up jumping to John McCain. So one thing I learned is whoever the bosses think is going to be the nominee, it's probably going to be somebody else. Nobody knows anything. And certainly that was true in 2016. But so I covered McCain all during 2008. And of course, I was on the McCain plane when I got a call from that same Ron Elving, this is 5 years later now, who said, how would you like to come to Washington and cover the White House? And Lehman Brothers had just gone under, the economy was going to hell. It just seemed like a really good time to move across the country and take on a lot more debt.
Seats right at the right time.
So I made the jump, and covering the early days of the Obama administration was, it's like drinking out of a fire hose. Gene Sperling, who had been an advisor in the Clinton administration and then went to work for Obama, and in between he'd been a script advisor on The West Wing. And he'd say that the big difference, in television is like everything gets wrapped up in an hour, and in Washington it never really works like that. But he said actually the first 6 months of the Obama administration were kind of like The West Wing. Everything was moving so fast, like, okay, let's take the weekend and decide if we're going to save General Motors, right? Or, you got an hour to figure out if Chrysler gets saved or not. And it was a very, it's hard to even remember now. And we didn't have anything like coronavirus, but we did have the H1N1 swine flu. We had pirates, as Obama used to say. There were a lot got thrown at them that first year. And it was crazy and exhilarating and frightening and all that stuff. But all of that was kind of external. all that was stuff that had happened and that the president had to deal with. So we go through 8 years, it sort of settles down, things come back to normal. The last 2 years of an 8-year administration are kind of, you kind of know what's going on. Things have fallen into a predictable pattern. Trump comes in, and now it's even more chaotic. But in most cases, all the chaos was internal. It was all being generated by the White House. I know that Trump likes to say he inherited a mess, but frankly, he inherited an economy that was in good shape, a world that was pretty peaceful. We did have ISIS, which was a problem, but not an existential threat to the United States. Other than North Korea, pretty much all the chaos of the first 2 years of the Trump administration were products of the chaotic way that they ran the White House. Mm-hmm. So the president thrives on that. He is a chaos president. He is a reality show impresario who wants to keep people tuning in. And as soon as one bit of chaos starts to die down, he says, "Tune in next time when we'll, I don't know, call the Ukrainians and and threaten to withhold arms unless they go after Joe Biden's son or something, whatever it might be." But so it was very different in that respect. And of course, on literally day one, the president was sworn in on a Friday, and on Saturday, Sean Spicer comes out and tells that whopper about the inaugural crowd being the largest in history. And like, wow, we are off to the races. This is going to be something.
What was it like? So you realized it was going to be different, but living in it, like living in it and covering the play-by-play, like I can't imagine how different it must have felt from covering the previous administration, right?
Yeah, it was very different, and I mean, I was not a lead reporter on the 2016 campaign, but obviously I had followed it as an interested citizen. I was mostly kind of keeping an eye on whatever the Obama team was up to in those last year or something. But I had watched all the debates, and I'd helped our fact checking and all that sort of stuff. So I wasn't unaware of what the president was like and some of his mannerisms and his ways of speaking and his bravado and all that sort of thing. Like a lot of people, I think I assume that some of that would just be tempered by circumstance and staff and the weight of being in the Oval Office. And mm-hmm. We're still waiting for that. I mean, that has not, the presidency did not change Donald Trump. Donald Trump changed the presidency.
That's so interesting. Okay, we'll transition back to economics, but also politics here. So obviously we are very close to a very big election in which we're expecting record turnout, and everyone is watching every twist and turn. But economics, the economy, it's the economy stupid, right, is what Bill Clinton said. Like you are in the political world no matter what at this point doing economics. So what do you think will be the key economic issues heading into this election? What do you think people are watching for? Is it as important as it has been in past elections?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm hesitant to make forecasts because we were all so wrong in 2016.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, there are just an awful lot of wild cards here. Including the one that got dealt at 7:30 Eastern time last Friday when we learned about Justice Ginsburg's passing. Mm-hmm. And whether that, as all the breathless commentary was, upends the campaign or not, I don't know. At this point, whether things are baked in or things can still change, I just don't know. But I'll tell you what I do know and what history tells us. While acknowledging history may be a poor guide because we're in such uncharted waters here. Historically, the economy is a very important factor in whether a president gets reelected or not. Maybe not the only factor, but it's up in the top 10. And in fact, there are some, political forecasting models that basically just use the economy. And one of the, and so, I remember covering the 2012 campaign, and no one had ever been reelected with unemployment as high as it was for Obama going into that campaign. But unemployment had come down a lot. It had gone as high as 10%, and now it was coming down. And so the thinking was, well, people vote on the trend, not the data point. So if people feel like things are getting better, that helps. One of the things that people pay a lot of that forecasters pay a lot of attention to is the stock market. So when the market tanked in the springtime, there were folks like Mark Zandi at Moody's were like, well, Trump's toast. I mean, the market has fallen so far, he's going to lose. Now we've had this tremendous rebound in the market. We had the NASDAQ and the S&P hit new highs this month. The Dow is within a few percentage points of its all-time high. At the same time, we've still got very high unemployment, although it's come, it was almost 15%. Now it's just north of 8%. So again, it's a little bit like with the Obama situation. The other thing is you've got the coronavirus, which is what's caused the economic crisis. To what extent do people think of that as like, yeah, but the economy was great until the pandemic hit, so as long as we can control the pandemic, we'll have a great economy. I don't know. Yeah. But the other thing to keep in mind is in 2019, when we had unemployment at the lowest level in half a century, Trump's approval rating was never as high as it should have been under those circumstances. If traditional models held. Mm-hmm. He has a Trump weight around his neck, which is keeping his approval down. Conversely, his approval ratings never fell as low this year as traditional models would have forecast, with 14.7% unemployment. And management, that I think any objective observer has to say management of the pandemic has been disastrous. So what that tells me is basically his approval rating has moved in a pretty narrow range throughout his whole presidency. And that just means attitudes are pretty baked in. 40% of the country will vote for this guy no matter what. 45% of the country would never vote for him in a million years. Even if the pandemic had never happened and we still had 3.5% unemployment. And how much of that persuadable squishy middle is actually persuadable or just is hanging up on the pollsters, I don't know. So.
No one wants to make predictions anymore, as you say.
I mean, y'all are probably better positioned to tell me, because obviously Arizona is more competitive in the presidential contest this year than it has been in the past. You've got, two competitive Senate contests. You got a competitive Senate contest, which is novel for Arizona. You've had a tough experience with the pandemic, but you've also had a great. I was just reading today. Your numbers have come way down, right? More faster than Texas, faster than Florida, faster than some of the other Sunbelt places gotten hard hit. So, how all that plays, I don't know. And then there's just the logistics of how is this election actually going to happen, right? Are people going to be able to vote? Are people going to be able to vote by mail? Are people going to be able to count the ballots by mail? Are we going to have, the precincts, the congressional precincts in New York where they were still counting 2 weeks later? You're like, really? I know we've only been in this democracy thing for 200 and some years, but so I think all that is a big wild card, and we still have legal challenges whether third-party candidates can get on the ballot in certain states and so forth. So there's a lot can happen between now and November, and God forbid between early November and whenever this thing gets called.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to ask you one more question from me before we turn to the audience questions, which are rolling in and look really interesting from what I've seen so far. So if you have them, send them into the chat. I'll get to as many as we can here in a few minutes. So final question for me, it's a journalism question because I get to do that. And I wonder, because you were in the White House, in the press corps, in the room, you know, when all of the media, the thought in the country about the media changed. I wonder what you think about this, because I think like the role of the press right now, the role of journalism right now is incredibly important, but I also feel like it's really in a precarious moment. Like facts are not always accepted as facts. We don't agree on what the facts are. Accuracy is degraded. You know, the idea of people just not believing the quote unquote the media, right? Like is becoming rampant. So
there's 3 areas that help grow IDC.
I don't know what that is, sorry.
Let's expand the IDC team. There are 3 Indigenous architects. You know, there's quite a bit of it. I think there's about 50 or 60 of us kicking around North America right now. Let's expand them. I have 3 on a line right now that are ready to come. So maybe there's a visiting scholar or an endowed position. It'd be phenomenal. Number 2, because of the lack of diversity and also women in this field, I would love to create a leadership academy, a mentoring program that would kind of fast track not only women, but diverse kids through architecture.
Thank you. Thanks, Molly. Sorry, guys.
Thank you.
So my question,
yeah,
sorry, is just about that.
Yeah.
Like, what do you see as the future of the free press going forward? Like, do you think that this is an institution we can keep in the position it should be in this country, or is it going to be continued to be challenged?
Well, I'll have to say, the news media was always something of a punching bag in my experience, well before President Trump came in. I mean, I got a lot of hostile emails covering the Kerry campaign, the McCain campaign, at the time when I was covering Obama, mostly from the public, but also covering Obama. He had a stable of attack dogs, you know, in the press office that would come after you if they didn't like something you'd written and beat up on you a good deal. Not as publicly as President Trump does, but you know, Obama was not an enormous friend of the news media. He could be plenty critical of us, often justifiably so. I mean, he thought we had a attention span of a gnat, and we tended to go off after whatever the latest shiny object was, and a lot of that is justified. But I never had the kind of antagonism we've had from this president, and it's clearly and it's interesting because on the other hand, Trump is a total he's a news hound. I mean, he's always beaten up on Maggie Haberman, but first thing he does every morning is read the New York Times. While he's watching Fox on the TV. He very much wants to be in the news. He courts the press. He tries to charm the press, but he's very thin-skinned when the press writes anything or says anything or broadcasts anything negative about him. And it's all with the aim of tearing down the sort of neutral arbiter of facts and muddying the waters enough or stirring up enough gorilla dust, as Jay Carney used to say, that, well, as long as nobody's sure what's going on, then how can we be sure he's lying? If the facts are in dispute, then if there's no such, if he questions the very notion of objective reality, if people buy his spiel that reality is whatever he says it is, that we're doing a great job on battling the coronavirus, for example, or that the economy is the best it's ever been, then we've really lost something. Aside from all that, I mean, just to put it in very crass terms, the news media is in a existential crisis on the business front. Yeah. There's the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal are all making money. They all have national readerships and paywalls and you know, a devoted following, and they've all added to their readership during the Trump administration. But you know, most local papers are struggling mightily. We're struggling mightily before the pandemic, and for many of them, this is just going to be the nail in the coffin. And I don't worry so much that the 49 seats in the White House briefing room are going to go unfilled, but I worry about all the empty seats in the press galleries at state capitals around the country and city council halls and all of the local businesses and institutions that are being undercovered or uncovered, going without coverage. I mean, not being exposed, but going without coverage, and that's a real test. And you know, the advertising based model that most of the news media has relied on is just irreparably broken. All that money has been diverted to Google and Facebook now, and so somebody's going to have to come up with a new model, and nobody's really been able to do so yet. You know, we're lucky in public radio. We have a different revenue stream, but we're not entirely insulated from this. You know, we also rely on underwriting dollars and advertising dollars, and that's taken a real hit. And it's interesting, during the pandemic, you know, traditional radio FM listenership has taken a hit too. So all that's just, you know, sort of a background challenge that will be here long after Donald Trump and his fisticuffs have gone.
That's for sure. All right, we're going to move to some audience questions before we finish things up. There's some really good ones. I want to start with two, I think, that have come in about the stock market. Rebecca asked, as of today, is the stock market leading the economy or lagging the economy? Right. Yeah. Don't buy or sell based on what he says. So she says, as of today, is the stock market leading the economy or lagging the economy?
I'm not sure it's either one. I think it's kind of divorced from the economy. And I have to tell you, I'm on vacation today, so I don't even know what the market did today. Was it up or down? It was down for the last 3 weeks, because I don't check my 401k when it's down. I only try to check it when it's up. But it is. I guess it would be nice to think it's a leading indicator, right? That where as the market plumbs new highs, that we're all going to follow, that we're going to justify those exalted values that we had 3 weeks ago. I don't pretend to understand what's going on in the market. I do know that much of the rally since it bottomed out early in the pandemic has come with a relative handful of big tech companies. I mean, I think most of the S&P most of the companies in the S&P were actually down, even though the overall index was hitting new highs in September, just because of you know, Facebook and Amazon and Apple and Google, or Alphabet, and you know, a handful of big tech companies were going great guns. Now, some of that is real. I mean, you know, it's not surprising that Amazon's valuation is up at a time when, you know, what was already a migration from traditional retailers to online retailers has been supercharged by the pandemic, right? I mean, I did a story last week on how municipal trash is piling up because everyone's living and working at home. And to illustrate it, I had a picture of some full garbage cans, and next to was a whole big stack of Amazon cardboard boxes. So, you know, the idea that Amazon is more valuable today than it was in January makes sense to me. But the idea that the overall market is the highest it's been at a time when we've got, you know, north of 11 million people out of work, and the government running huge deficits just to keep the businesses and families afloat is a little bit of a head scratcher for sure.
Yeah.
I know there are explanations that have to do with, you know, very, very low interest rates, and so you discount everything a little bit differently, and people chasing yield wherever they can get, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
Yeah, yeah. Another one on this that sort of dovetails, I think, well from John. He says, why is the stock market used as a primary indicator of how well the economy is doing when such a small percentage of Americans own stocks, right? Like, is it time to focus more on other indicators so we have a better understanding of how the economy is doing? Because as you say, there's a real dichotomy there.
Yeah, almost surely we would be better off focusing on something else. I mean, part of it's just tradition. Part of it is it's a nice way to end a newscast because you can say as much or as little as time allows, right? If you got 30 seconds, you can go through all the different indices, and if you got 5 seconds, say the Dow's up, and that's I'm Corbett Coleman. We're done.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't usually do a whole lot of reporting on the market. My colleague Jim Zaroli, who's based in New York, has been more of our markets guy, but during the work from home era, which is now 6 months and counting, I have gotten in the habit of filing a market open spot every morning. The newscast likes to have a little fresh material coming in kind of mid-morning, which is our time mid-morning as the market opens. And it also just for me sort of forces me to get dressed and go to work. I have to be at my desk, kind of read in and up to speed when the market opens, so I can write something very quickly and have it out there. But I do, as much as possible, try to. The spot usually says, the market did X, Y, or Z in the first half hour of trading, and then I usually try to broaden it out into whatever's happening with some durable goods orders or industrial production or the unemployment claims that week or something else to try to add some context to it. And very often it's sort of perverse, like, the market opened up 200 points this morning on news that another 4 million people filed claims for unemployment. Well, that's, go figure.
Right. Another question along these lines, but a little different, from Kay. She asks, what prevents some big actor like Warren Buffett or George Soros or the Koch brothers, for that matter, from manipulating the stock market right before the election?
Well, I guess that's what the SEC is for. When you say manipulating the market, I'm not sure obviously if Warren Buffett were to sell all of his stocks at once, that would tend to depress the market a good deal. And maybe that would, and he's generally on the Democratic side, so maybe that would be helpful to Joe Biden, but I don't think Warren Buffett's going to do that. So that wouldn't really be manipulation. That's just buying and selling. If you mean doing something sort of more nefarious, I guess that's what the SEC is supposed to be keeping an eye on.
Supposed to be regulators here.
What's it?
Supposed to be regulators here.
Yeah, there was some news I know a couple of weeks ago about how SoftBank was buying was having a bunch of options and was somehow responsible for some of the run up in tech share prices. But I think that was about making money more than about trying to influence the election. And I'm not. I mean, if the market were to plunge on the eve of the election, which way would that swing it? I'm not even sure. I mean, I remember on election night in 2016 seeing the futures market fall 1,000 points, and then within a day or two it had bounced back to be on par or even up a little bit, and then of course it's gone off to the races since then. It's been basically up throughout Trump's time, although every so often it'll tank on some, but pre-pandemics it would tank on news of the trade war or something like that.
Do you think that the market itself really affects the way people vote? Like, have we seen that, or is this much more about the way the economy is affecting your life? Like, if you're out of a job, do you care that the stock market's doing well?
Yeah, I think in normal times, if people are working and the economy is relatively stable, then a high stock market makes people feel a little bit better about the economy, even if they don't personally have a lot of stock, and a crappy market makes them feel a little bit worse about the economy. But I have a hard time believing that a booming stock market is going to overcome how people feel if they're personally out of work, or if their partner's out of work, or if they're worried about the future of their job. I mean, I think in a time when the real economy is going through such spasms, what happens on the market is just kind of background noise for most people. And
Yeah.
One of the earlier questions had to do with the narrow stock ownership. I mean, it is whenever say lawmakers want to cut the capital gains tax or do something that favors stock investors, they like to talk about how, well, most people own stock through their retirement plans. And that's not a complete fiction. They're about now most it's the vast majority of stocks are held by a very thin slice of people at the top of the income ladder, and then another, say, half of the income distribution has a little bit of money in the stock market, usually through their retirement plan, and then the whole bottom 45 or 50% has next to nothing in the stock market. So half the country, in broad terms, half the country has nothing in the market, half the country has a little bit in the market, and the top 10% has a lot of money in the market. So it is certainly a talking point that the stock market affects everyone because of the retirement savings. And yeah, kind of. But I mean, if you've got $10,000 in a Roth IRA and you own your house, you're not, whatever's happening in the market is not having a huge impact on your wealth, your family wealth.
Yeah. Okay, a little bit of a different question here. This is from Gretchen. This is back to your covering the White House in the press room days. Trump is known for being very sensitive to questions he's asked, often demeaning or ignoring journalists whose questions he doesn't like. So if they don't fit his agenda, how do you have to change, or how have you asked questions differently since the Obama administration? Did you have to switch your tactic or just sort of get a thicker skin?
That's a good question. They're obviously, I mean, I sort of separate what happens in the press room on camera, which is all kind of a kabuki theater. It's a performance on both sides, both by the journalists, not all of them, but a lot of the journalists, especially the cable TV guys, use that as a platform to, showcase how tough they can be, versus what happens off camera, out of the press room, maybe on Air Force One or something like that, or 90% of what we do, which is buttonholing somebody on the phone or at their desk. Well, back in the days when we actually used to go to the White House, in private, and that's actually about trying to get information. And most of my questions are aimed at trying to get information. I mean, sometimes we need to get something on tape, so we'll ask something in the briefing room. Just to get a piece of tape, not because we actually expect to learn anything from it. We just want to have the spokesperson saying X, Y, or Z on tape so we can play it on the radio.
Yeah.
But most of the work I used to do was actually aimed at getting a piece of information. And there are some people in the Trump administration. I'd say in general, the Trump administration is just routinely hostile. They're just like pieces of information that would be beneficial to them and easy to provide. They will not provide just because they don't want to do it. They don't want to be helpful. And also, I mean, I can understand it must be hell to work in the Trump press office because, I mean, I think just yesterday, McEnany said something like, "Oh, the president's probably going to name his court pick on Wednesday," and then 30 minutes later, he goes on Fox and Friends and says, "I'll probably do it Saturday."
Right.
So now I don't think she made up the Wednesday, right? There must have been some conversation among the staff that it's, when should he do it? And someone must have said it'll be Wednesday. And so she floats that, and then she gets embarrassed by the president half an hour later, which happens all the time to everybody, whether it's cabinet secretaries or flunkies in the press office. So I can certainly see after 3 years of trying to trying to speak for a completely unpredictable president, you would just stop answering questions altogether if you possibly could. Which in fact the previous press secretary did. I mean, we had a press secretary for I don't know how many months it was who never held a press briefing, and
Yep. See, that's fascinating because so much of what we see or hear, right, is just from the briefing room. But you're saying a lot of this happens behind the scenes, most of it.
Yeah, I mean, and that was true even in the Obama administration, which actually had daily briefings, which were, sometimes combative, but also a forum where real information was conveyed and real questions were asked. But, if the question is, when did you stop beating Melania, you're not going to get a useful answer, unless the whole thing is to provoke some snide comment from the president. But so I don't have a lot of use for the kind of, why do you keep lying to the American people, Mr. President? What's he going to say to that? He's going to lie about something else, I suppose. That's not helpful. On the other hand, why haven't you invoked the Defense Procurement Act to get more N95 masks? That might be a more interesting question or more interesting answer.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But I will say, by the way, we talked about my background in San Diego. Peter Navarro, who is now the trade czar for the administration. I knew Peter from San Diego. He was a 4-time unsuccessful politician in San Diego. He was a Democrat back then. This was before he became a kind of China basher, but he ran for mayor, he ran for Congress, he ran for county commission, and I think maybe city council or something.
Huh.
Lost each time, probably because he lived in Irvine, which is not a great recommendation if you want to hold political office in San Diego. But imagine my surprise when this guy washes up on the banks of the Potomac as the trade czar. And apparently the story is that during the campaign of 2016, they Googled around to try to find some economist who would say something like what Trump was spouting in terms of protectionist policy. And I guess the only one that popped up was Peter Navarro, so they hired him.
That's so interesting. It all comes back around at some point, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, here's a question from Tom. He says, what do you see as the economic impact of discussions around filling the seat of the Supreme Court, which is dominating the news in all realm now? Is there an economic angle here?
I'm sure there is. I mean, I've not made a study of, what Ginsburg's legacy was in terms of rulings on corporate law or business law, and those generally are not the cases that get decided at the end of the term and that get all the breathless headlines. But a fair amount of what the High Court does, and certainly what the appeals courts do, is helping to spell out what the rules of the road are for businesses around the country. And obviously, one big and contentious area that is on the ballot is what's going to happen with environmental regulation going forward, climate regulation going forward. Is Trump going to be able to continue the sort of deregulatory rollback of all the climate regs that had been put in place in the Obama administration, or is Biden going to come in and try to resurrect all that stuff? And either way, it's going to be litigated. It's either going to be California suing because over something Trump wants to do, or Texas suing over something Biden wants to do. And a lot of those cases don't make it all the way to the Supreme Court. They're decided to the lower courts, but some of them will. And so a more conservative justice might tip the balance along those lines. It's been a pretty pro-business, anti-regulatory court anyway, even in its makeup last Thursday. But I'm sure if Trump is successful, I imagine it will tip the balance more in that direction. But it's not all black and white. I mean, one of the things that Justice Gorsuch from my home state of Colorado was sort of famous for was his criticism of what's called Chevron deference, which is when cabinet agencies get to write the rules to implement some piece of legislation, and basically the courts are supposed to show great deference to the experts within the government agency.
Mm-hmm.
And Gorsuch has been skeptical of that, and depending on who the experts are, that can work either way. I mean, the experts in the current administration have a very different view of what they would like to do with the rulemaking than the experts in a potential Biden administration.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, here's one more question. I think this is the last one. So if anybody else has more, we have a little bit more time, so you're welcome to ask them. Otherwise, we can let Scott go eat dinner because he's probably getting hungry. So this is from Rebecca, and she says, what do you make of the difference between Mnuchin and Navarro and what they said about the prospects for a new coronavirus relief package? And what do you think of those prospects? I meant to ask this earlier. This is a very interesting question. We can't read the tea leaves here, but you mentioned, the massive impact of the first CARES package, the CARES Act, and the stimulus that went out. What impact would it mean if we have another one? Do you think it's possible to happen?
I think it's possible that it will happen, and I was frankly surprised that it didn't happen months ago, because I would have thought it would have been in the president's interest to push another package. I mean, I would think if I were running for re-election in a kind of shaky economic recovery, the opportunity to send $1,200 checks to everybody, a month before the election or 2 months before the election would be very attractive. And the idea of putting another sort of jack under the flat tire of consumer spending, that seemed to me completely in the president's interest. And I thought that the Democrats in Congress, in fact, the Democrats in Congress did pass such a bill, even though it's probably not in their interest, politically to help the president's economy or to help but that's just what Democrats do. So I'm kind of surprised that it hasn't happened, but you do have, you have this relatively new chief of staff, Mark Meadows, former Freedom Caucus, very conservative congressman, who apparently is calling the shots. I mean, I think if Mnuchin and Pelosi had been left to their own devices, they would have cut a deal. Whether it would have been $1.5 trillion or $2 trillion, I don't know. But apparently, it was Meadows that kind of put the kibosh on that. Probably Meadows that's put the kibosh on any other kind of big spending. As you say, Mnuchin was on the Hill yesterday testifying along with the Fed chairman, and they both said, we need more fiscal juice for this economy. We'd like you to do it. We're ready to sign something. Let's get it done. Then you've got, Rebecca said Navarro, and he may have weighed in on this too. I didn't hear what he said, but I know that the head of the National Economic Council, Larry Kudlow, who plays an economist on TV, has said that we don't need any additional stimulus. The quote unquote V-shaped recovery will continue apace on its own. I don't know what Larry's looking at. That it's not the statistics I'm looking at. I see a pretty clear deceleration of the V, and not entirely positive it wouldn't turn into a W if we're not careful. I don't think that's likely, but I think what we're going to see is this sort of a reverse check mark or whatever, where or the square root symbol or whatever. The right hand side of the V has gotten halfway up and it's kind of stalling out right now. So
I think that's square root. I'm trying to remember high school math classes.
Yeah, sorry, it's turn right. It's not a good letter that looks like what it is, but it's Kudlow is a little bit, and this is probably why the president likes him, is they both sort of subscribe to this power of positive thinking or power of positive chit chat thing, that if you say enough nice things about the economy, it'll take off. I think he's dead wrong on that, but I mean that Larry Kudlow is also the one that told us we had the coronavirus entirely locked down in March, so take it with a big grain of salt.
So what do you see like long-term, what do the long-term projections on this look like? If we do at some point, whether it's now or in a few months, pass a stimulus package to get things going again, how long can that last? Like, what has to happen on the other end of the economic spectrum to make sure that we don't need to keep doing it?
Yeah, well, I mean, ultimately, we need to get control of the virus. That's the only way we're going to have a sustainable economic recovery is to get control of the virus, presumably through a successful vaccine. Although, really successful therapeutics would work okay, and I guess worst case scenario, if we get none of that, eventually the virus will exhaust it, all the uninfected people. I mean, that is how the pandemic ended in 18 and 19, right? 1918 and 19, right? I mean, an awful lot of people died, and everybody else got sick and got over it, and ultimately there was nobody left to infect, and so that would not be the ideal way to do it, but that could happen. But hopefully we will get a vaccine and to short circuit that, so we don't have to go that route. But eventually, all pandemics do come to an end. This one will too, and the economy will recover. And the purpose of this fiscal foam on the runway is just to sort of keep families and businesses afloat till we get to that other side. Obviously, we've already lost a lot of businesses, and we're going to lose more before we're done with this. But if we can lose fewer, and if we can keep people in their homes and in their apartments and keep groceries in the pantry, that certainly helps. And the other piece of it is help state and local governments, which are strapped because their tax revenues have dried up at the same time they had a lot of expenses for fighting the pandemic. What happened in the Great Recession was, we had sort of the first wave when the housing bubble burst and everything, and we had what seemed like unbelievable layoffs, 700,000 people losing their job in 1 month. Then there was sort of a second wave when the state and local governments saw their revenues dry up, and they had to lay off a bunch of teachers and firefighters and people like that because they had to balance their budgets. That is avoidable if the feds would send some aid their way. So that would be an important thing for them to do. So yeah, I think there is more that the federal government could do to be helpful and to make this hopefully 6-month or 8-month period or year-long period or whatever it's going to be less painful than it otherwise will be. Otherwise, the more people lose their jobs, the more people get cast out of their homes, all of that, it leaves a scar so that even when the economy recovers, it's a weaker, slower, tougher recovery than it otherwise would have to be.
Yeah. You reminded me in your answer of a question I almost missed here. Rebecca says, I'm very concerned about a pending homelessness crisis. Evictions have been temporarily suspended, but eventually people will be evicted. And actually, I've done some reporting on this lately. Evictions are still being filed. People are still being evicted. It just is harder to do. What do you think, she says, can we do as a country to prevent a tsunami of homelessness?
Yeah, on top of the existing homelessness problem that we have, right? I mean,
right.
It was. I mean, I don't know what it's like in Phoenix, but here in Washington, before the even when we had a very good economy with very low unemployment, right outside NPR's offices, there were an awful lot of people sleeping in tents underneath the metro overpass. Mm-hmm. And yes, obviously that we run the risk of that getting worse. And it is a challenge. I mean, we had in the CARES Act, there was this moratorium on evictions that was sort of limited to, it only applied to apartments that had a federally backed mortgage and that sort of thing. And as a tenant, how do you know if your landlord has a federally backed mortgage? So how do you know if you're covered by this or not? Yeah. But it also it does just kind of shift the problem. I mean, if tenants don't pay their rent and the landlord still has to pay his or her mortgage on the building, that's tough for them too. So better is probably just to find a way to put cash in people's pockets so they can pay the rent and keep the money, that way the landlord doesn't get stuck with the tab. I mean, nobody's going to shed a tear for the Kushner family if some of their apartments don't pay their rents. But there's lots of there are lots of quote unquote mom and pop landlords who own a fourplex that they bought, and that's their retirement fund, and it's kind of tough to tell them, well, you just have to lump it while your tenants aren't able to pay the rent. Better to put money in the tenants' pocket so they can pay the rent. And actually, it's through the bulk of the summer, we actually saw most people did pay the rent. I mean, rent delinquencies were by some surveys were lower in 2020 than they had been in 2019. I think with the end of the supplemental unemployment benefits, that's probably going to be a different picture. In fact, my colleague Chris Arnold had a story, I think yesterday, about folks who used the last of their savings to pay the September rent, and now we're a week out from, or 10 days out from October coming due, and they don't know how they're going to do that. So I do think that's going to be a challenge. And obviously, we had this order now a couple of weeks ago from the CDC saying on public health grounds that you can't have evictions, which makes all kinds of sense, because obviously the worst thing you can do not the worst thing, but a bad thing you can do to spread the virus is send a bunch of people outside and into homeless shelters or something like that, crowded cramped conditions, or moving in with their elderly parents or their 6 kids in a apartment or whatnot. So there is a good public health argument to make against evictions, but as you point out, Lauren, I mean, there's all kinds of workarounds, legal and illegal, that landlords can pull on that. And the folks getting the eviction notice, they're not always the most savvy about real estate law and what their rights are, and legal aid may or may not have the resources to help them. And so it's pretty vulnerable people that might be cast out in those circumstances.
Yeah. A question from Susan here. She says, what do you think of the impact of the Fed's maintenance of a a near zero interest rate with or without additional congressional stimuli?
Maybe you can clarify a little bit, Susan. I mean, are you talking about sort of just their policies in the current situation, or are you talking about the new framework that the Fed put out just a couple of weeks ago, talking about keeping rates near zero for basically a super long period of time?
Feel free to unmute and clarify if you'd like, Susan.
Or I'll just do the politicians thing, and I'll answer the question I want to answer, which is, I think the Fed has been really aggressive in doing pretty much all they can to keep the credit markets functioning properly. They acted really quickly. They acted aggressively. It's for the most part worked. They have set up a few novel programs like this Main Street lending program, which has been kind of a dud. Nobody's taking advantage of it. And they got the Fed chairman got a lot of questions about that on the Hill yesterday. That's a new program. They're still going to keep tweaking it. I'm dubious it's going to make a whole lot of difference. But they've said, look, we've done all we can to help the current crisis. Now we need Congress to step in and provide some more aid. And I think that's probably right. But the Fed also adopted this new framework at quote unquote at Jackson Hole, which is always a great August get together. All these central bankers from all over the world get together in the Tetons and talk about interest rates and go for hiking and fishing and that kind of stuff. And it's always a nice junket if you can get a ticket to go. And of course, this year it was another Brady Bunch Zoom call. But at that virtual conference this year, the Fed unveiled their new long-term strategy, which is basically to prioritize full employment and basically worry less about inflation. You know, in historically they have kind of preemptively raised interest rates whenever the unemployment rate came down low enough to make them kind of worried about possible inflation, even if there wasn't any evidence of it. You saw that, for example, in 2018. You know, they started raising interest rates partly to fend off inflation, and also just so they'd have a little bit of running room when they needed to cut rates again, because they've been near zero for a long time. But what they basically concluded now is that unemployment can go a lot lower than they thought it could without sparking inflation, and that had really good benefits for all kinds of folks. You know, the people who'd been on the margins of the job market who came in the last year or two or three of the decade-long expansion. And that had really positive effects for people who had not really shared in the gains of the recovery until that time. And so the Fed's now basically put everyone on notice, hey, we're not going to raise interest rates preemptively anymore. We're going to let the economy run hotter for longer, and we're going to wait till we see the whites of the eyes of inflation north of 2% before we raise interest rates. And in fact, we're going to let inflation coast above 2% for a while, since it's been below 2% for so long. Now, you know, they announced this at a time when even talking about full employment seems crazy, because we're so far from that point. And this doesn't really tell us anything about what the Fed's going to do next month or next year, but it's a guide for what they're going to do 2, 3, 4 years, let's hope, in the future, if we ever get back to where we have really low unemployment. And what they're going to do is basically let it ride until we see higher inflation. And that's an interesting kind of real-time experiment. We'll see what happens with it.
Yeah. Okay, I think this is the last question. So here you go. And we're going to end with China. This is from Zona, asking, what is your feeling about China? Are they not the premier world economic power? Shouldn't we be working on a way to collaborate?
Yeah. You know, I think there's a lot of agreement that there have been that China has been a bad actor in certain ways on the global stage, in particular things like intellectual property theft and some of the ways they've sort of thrown their weight around in global trade. And that was the stated reason for the Trump administration to pursue this very costly trade war, which has mostly backfired and hasn't done much to stop the bad actions on the part of the Chinese. At the same time, the president, of course, pulled out of the 12-nation TPP on his second or third day in office, which was the Obama administration's effort to kind of get all the relevant players together on one page so that they could kind of collectively pressure China to clean up its act on the trade front. But you know, trade aside, obviously China is a rising economic power, a risen economic power. I mean, they're a huge number 2 economic player, and cooperation is the only way that we can tackle big problems like climate change. I mean, we're never going to get a solution to climate change without China's help, and frankly, without the United States' help. And of course, now China is you know, we get the big success was getting China and India and Brazil and some of the other previous holdouts into the Paris Climate Accord. And of course, now we're not in the Paris Climate Accord. You know, maybe that'll change if we get a new administration. But you know, big problems like that can only be solved collectively. And I guess one of the things for me that's been so frustrating about the pandemic is, you know, this is truly I mean, it puts the pan in pandemic, right? This is truly a worldwide problem. The virus doesn't have any respect for international borders. The virus doesn't follow WTO rules. The virus is everyone is equally susceptible to the virus. And it's kind of like that, the Independence Day thing or something where it's an asteroid heading towards the planet. If ever there was a time when the world ought to be working together, it's now. And similarly on things like climate change, but that's a little bit more of an abstract problem. It's hard to get people's heads wrapped around it. The pandemic is urgent and clear and obvious. And I'm encouraged at the way that the scientific community has worked together. I mean, it's when you read what scientists are doing and the cooperation and the information sharing and, China making available the DNA of the genetic code of the sequence of the virus, in record time. And then, all these scientists in all these different countries, competing obviously, but also cooperating to fight this global collective threat. It's encouraging. And yet on the political front and with our own leadership kind of leading the way, putting up these artificial barriers and which is not to say that, China's conduct in the early weeks of their own epidemic were exemplary, but I think they got right pretty quick with it, and they came clean pretty quickly with it. And now to try to use to blame China to cover up our own lapses in this country is just embarrassing, I think, and counterproductive. And there's a fair amount of concern that if and when we get a vaccine, there's going to be vaccine nationalism and fights over distribution, when again, none of us is going to be safe until everybody's safe. And we should, if we haven't learned by now, we should have, that we're not going to be able to wall ourselves off from this pandemic and similar threats in the future. And so I think for all that we will compete and want to impose some rules on China, I think we're going to have to be able to cooperate. And also, if you want to impose rules on China, you kind of have to obey the rules yourself. And so it's tough to criticize other countries for bad behavior when we're just thumbing our nose at international standards and conventions, which Republican and Democratic presidents in this country spent the better part of the last century trying to build up.
Wise words to end on, I would say. The worst part about a Zoom event is that we can't all applaud you at the same time or in the right way, but everyone who's there, unmute and applaud. We thank you so much for your time and for doing this for us. I think we picked your brain on every topic we could have at this point. So thank you so much.
Well, it's really fun. Thank you so much for having me. I always enjoy doing these. I enjoy them even more when we can do them in person, and I look forward to the day when we can do that again.
Next time, yes.
Yes, Scott, thank you so much. Lauren, thanks for helping us get through this vast number of questions. It was terrific. And frankly, we did cover a lot of ground. It was really insightful. Thanks to both of you for taking the time. Appreciate that.
Thanks a lot.
You.
All right, thanks everybody. Have a great evening. Thank you so much for your support. We'll do this again soon. Take care.